On May 10, 1869, America celebrated a golden spike and a new legend. The railroad had finally united the nation. Newspapers loved the image, gentlemen in dark coats, telegraph wires humming, a journey once measured in months suddenly cut to a week. But that famous moment hid almost everything that mattered. It hid the thousands of Chinese laborers who had blasted through granite, hung from ropes over cliffs, and vanished into snow, often for less pay and greater danger. It hid the dead because the company never kept a full count. And it hid what came next. Because finishing the line did not end the story, it began something else entirely. The men who sold the railroad as progress would go on to control land, freight, ports, and politics across the West, deciding which towns lived, which farmers broke, and how much freedom ordinary people actually had. The spike was golden. The system behind it was iron. On May 10th, 1869, America threw a party for itself. The telegraph lines carried the news in seconds. Bells rang in New York and San Francisco simultaneously. In Sacramento, a locomotive was draped in flags. In Washington, the War Department fired a salute. From coast to coast, people understood that something enormous had happened, something that could not be undone. A nation that had nearly destroyed itself in civil war had, just 4 years later, driven an iron road straight through its own wilderness and called itself whole again. The photograph from Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, shows what that moment wanted to look like. Men in dark coats and tall hats surround 2 locomotives facing each other across a narrow gap in the desert. Bottles of champagne were waiting. Executives from the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific shook hands. A polished ceremonial spike made of California gold was tapped gently into a pre-drilled hole in a polished laurel tie. The telegram went out. It said simply, "Done." The image is real. The moment was real. The celebration, the pride, the national exhale, all of it was real. But almost everything that mattered was not in the frame. The men who built the road were not in the photograph, not the ones who had driven iron through granite at 9,000 feet, not the ones who had lowered themselves over cliff faces on rope baskets to hand-drill holes for blasting powder, not the ones who had lived through winters in the Sierra Nevada, tunneling through snow and rock in shifts that never stopped, sleeping in burrows cut into the same mountains they were paid to conquer. There were as many as 15,000 of them at peak construction, and they made up nearly 90% of the Central Pacific workforce for much of the project. They were Chinese, and the company that employed them, the company that said publicly that without them the line could not have been completed, made no organized effort to record how many of them died. The estimates historians have assembled range from several hundred to well over 1,000. The true number is unknown because the company did not count. That absence is not an accident of record-keeping. It is the first silence in a long story of what the railroad chose to remember and what it chose not to. But the photograph hides something else, something larger than the missing dead, larger even than the missing workers. It hides what came next. The men who stood in that photograph were not finished. They were not men who built a railroad and then went home. They were men who had discovered, in the course of building a railroad, how much power the railroad gave them, and they intended to use it. The Central Pacific became the Southern Pacific. The line extended south through California and east toward Texas. It grew until it controlled not just tracks, but the conditions of life for farmers, merchants, ports, and politicians across the American West. It dictated which towns could survive. It set the price a farmer paid to move his grain to market. It decided Which harbor would define California's future commerce? It placed men of its choosing inside the legislature, the courts, and the offices that were supposed to hold it accountable. It learned to use dependence as a form of power more durable than any locomotive. None of that is in the photograph. This story begins at Promontory because that is where the public story ends. The Golden Spike was not the completion of an American promise. It was the beginning of an American machine. To understand what that machine became and who paid for it and who it was built to serve, we have to go back to before the money arrived, to the man who first believed in the mountain crossing when no one else would stake $1 on the idea. The Golden Spike shone in the Utah sun. Beneath it, the ground still held the labor of 10,000 hands that history was already learning to forget. The celebration was real. The system behind it was iron, and it was only just beginning. Before there was an empire, there was an engineer with a map he had drawn himself, and a dream he could not stop explaining. Theodore Judah arrived in California in 1854, hired to build a short railroad out of Sacramento. But from the moment he reached the Sierra Nevada and looked east toward the peaks, he became a man possessed by a single idea. The Sierra Nevada, which everyone who knew mountains called impassable for a railroad, was, in his assessment, passable. He had found a route. He had walked it himself, ridge by ridge, measuring grades and elevations in terrain where most men saw only obstacle. He had drawn it. He had calculated it down to the foot. He believed in it the way certain engineers believe in things, not with the vague faith of an optimist, but with the specific conviction of a man who has done the math and trusts what the numbers say. He spent years trying to convince people. He made the argument in Sacramento drawing rooms, in San Francisco offices, in the halls of Congress. He carried scale models of his proposed grades, handed out maps and pamphlets he had printed himself. He was serious and relentless in a way that some found inspiring and others found exhausting. Congressmen who met him once often found him back the following session with better diagrams and the same unshakable certainty. The route was real. The engineering was sound. The capital was not there. The moment that changed everything came in 1860, when Judah found a path to Sacramento's merchant class. A group of men agreed to hear his case in a small room above a hardware store. They were not dreamers in the way Judah was a dreamer. Leland Stanford sold groceries and had political ambitions. Collis Huntington sold hardware and had a mind for leverage. Mark Hopkins kept accounts with meticulous precision. Charles Crocker sold dry goods and had the physical confidence of a man who had always gotten what he wanted through sheer force of presence. These four men understood almost immediately that a transcontinental railroad would not merely be a public convenience. It would be the most powerful commercial instrument in the American West for a generation or more. They agreed to back the project. The Central Pacific Railroad was incorporated in 1861. Judah was grateful. He needed capital, and capital required men like these. But almost from the beginning, the partnership was uneasy in ways he could not fully see. He thought he was creating a railroad. They thought they were creating a corporation. As construction began and federal money started flowing, Judah grew alarmed at how the Big Four were managing the company's finances, directing money through a subsidiary they controlled in ways that enriched themselves at the project's expense. He was right. He tried to push back. He began looking for investors in New York who might buy out the Big Four. In the fall of 1863, Judah boarded a ship for the East Coast, likely carrying documents he hoped would break their grip. He crossed the Isthmus of Panama. He contracted yellow fever during the crossing. He reached New York, and 2 weeks later, at 37 years old, he was dead. The railroad he had surveyed, argued for, and begged into existence would be built without him. His route was correct. His dream came true, and the men who completed it built something he never intended, a system that used his vision as its foundation and grew far beyond anything his idealism had imagined. The moment he handed his vision to men with money, the dream did not disappear. It simply ceased to be the point. The United States government did not stumble into the railroad business. It chose to enter it deliberately, with very specific reasons that had almost nothing to do with commerce. By the early 1860s, the nation was at war with itself. The Union needed to hold California, its gold, its silver, its Pacific coastline. But California was 3,000 miles from Washington, separated by desert, mountain range, and hostile territory. Communication took weeks. Movement of troops took months. Without a fast, reliable land connection to the West Coast, the far edge of the country could drift toward whatever power was willing to reach it first. On July 1st, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act into law. The ACT authorized 2 railroad companies, the Central Pacific Building east from California, the Union Pacific Building west from the Missouri River, to construct a continuous transcontinental line, and it made that construction possible through instruments of national power. The federal government granted each company a right-of-way 200 feet wide through public land, plus 10 alternate sections of territory per mile of track laid, a checkerboard on either side of the line the companies could sell, develop, or hold. It issued federal bonds valued at $16,000 per mile through flat terrain, $32,000 through plateau country, and $48,000 through the mountains. These were not favors quietly arranged. They were public policy, signed by the president during wartime. In exchange, the railroads were asked to build the line and give the government preferential rates for mail, troops, and supplies. That was the bargain. What the government did not fully anticipate was how men of a certain kind would use that bargain as raw material. The Big Four understood that the land grants were not just support for construction, they were the beginning of an asset base. Millions of acres on either side of whatever line they built would belong to them. And the value of that land would be determined largely by the railroad itself, where it built, which towns it served, which routes it developed. The company would set the worth of its own grants simply by deciding where to go. It was a structural advantage written into federal law, one that meant the railroad did not merely carry goods across the West. It shaped which goods, from which places, could reach markets at all. The Central Pacific also moved quickly to maximize bond payments, paying more per mile in mountain terrain. Leland Stanford, by then governor of California, helped secure a definition of the foothills that extended the higher federal rate to terrain most engineers would not have called mountainous. It was legal. It was also precisely the kind of maneuver that revealed who these men were. The Pacific Railway Act was written to bind the continent. It accomplished that, but it also handed 4 Sacramento merchants federal land, federal credit, a route monopoly, and the structural power to determine the economic fate of every community within their reach. The government had built the foundation. The Big Four would build everything that stood on top of it. In the summer of 1865, the Central Pacific had a problem that no amount of capital or federal subsidy could immediately solve. It did not have enough workers. The men the company had been hiring, mostly Irish immigrants and local laborers, were not staying. The work was brutal. The wages were modest. The California gold fields still offered the possibility, however remote, of sudden wealth. Workers drifted away. Every month of delay was money left uncollected. Charles Crocker, the construction superintendent, understood how to organize labor and push men past the point where they thought they could stop. When someone suggested hiring Chinese workers, Crocker was skeptical. Conventional thinking in California held that they were suited to light work, not heavy construction. He agreed to try a small crew anyway. The Chinese workers proved exceptional by every measure the company used. They showed up, they stayed. They worked in organized gangs under headmen who coordinated with foremen. They maintained their own camps, prepared their own food, drank boiled tea rather than water that sickened others. They learned blasting techniques quickly, adapted without resistance, and kept pace with a schedule that was eating through the company's margins. Crocker expanded the crews, then expanded them again. By 1868, their numbers had reached somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000, as many as 20,000 over the full course of the project, comprising as much as 90% of the workforce. Leland Stanford described them as quiet, peaceable, industrious, economical. Crocker called them far more reliable. These were not tributes born of respect. They were assessments of performance. But the scale of dependence the words reveal is striking. The railroad could not have been built on schedule without them. And yet the PI told a different story than the praise. Chinese workers earned approximately $30 to $35 per month. White workers in equivalent roles earned a similar rate, but the company provided white workers with housing and food. Chinese workers paid for their own provisions out of their wages. When those costs were subtracted, the effective gap was substantial. The company extracted more labor per dollar from Chinese workers than from any other group. This was not coincidence. It was policy. The racial logic of California in the 1860s, which held that this arrangement was simply the natural order of things. The men who ran the Central Pacific called the Chinese workers essential and irreplaceable because they were. Then they paid them less, charged them more, and left their names off the commemorative record of the road they built. Eventually, Leland Stanford put it plainly in a letter to the President of the United States. "Without the Chinese workers," he wrote, "it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national enterprise." Impossible. That was the word he used. The men who had been told they were not strong enough for the mountains were, by the testimony of the man who employed them, the only reason the mountains could be crossed at all. They were about to prove it. From the Sacramento Valley, the Sierra Nevada looked manageable. The mountains rose in the distance like a painted backdrop, blue and white and remote. Theodore Judah had studied them for years and concluded a railroad could pass through. He was correct, but correct about the route and prepared for what the Sierra actually demanded were two different things. By 1866, the Chinese crews had moved out of the foothills and into the mountains. The landscape changed almost immediately. Gentle grades gave way to granite walls that rose hundreds of feet, sheer and indifferent. There were no paths, no existing roads above a certain elevation that could support the machinery the railroad required. Everything, tools, black powder, food, timber for ties and snow sheds, iron for rails, had to be hauled up by hand, by mule, and by improvised rigging through terrain that had never been asked to support industrial construction. The tunnels were the defining challenge. The Sierra crossing required boring through solid granite at elevations approaching 7,000 feet. 15 tunnels needed to be cut through the mountain. The longest, the Summit Tunnel, was nearly 1,700 feet of solid rock. Black powder could advance a tunnel face by perhaps 8 inches per day when conditions cooperated. At that rate, the Summit Tunnel alone would take years. The company did not have years. The Chinese crews adopted a method of hand drilling and precision blasting that allowed them to work multiple tunnel faces simultaneously. The main face and two additional faces opened from a central shaft drilled down from above. This required dropping men on ropes into a narrow vertical hole in the mountain, blasting a working chamber at the bottom, then spreading outward in both directions while the main crews pressed inward from the tunnel mouths. The coordination required between crews working in near darkness, linked only by the timing of blasts and progress measured in feet per week, demanded a collective discipline the company had never asked of a workforce before and rarely acknowledged after. Along the steepest cliff sections above the American River Canyon, the Chinese workers were lowered over the edge in rope slings to hand-drill blast holes into vertical granite. A worker would be lowered, drill his holes, pack them with powder, light a fuse, and be hauled back up before the charge went off. The timing was not always perfect. Some men did not make it back up in time. The company did not record how many. The winters made everything worse. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the most severe in Sierra memory. Snow buried the work camps entirely. Workers lived and labored in a world of white. Tunnels cut through snow connected sleeping quarters, cookhouses, and tunnel faces. They did not see the sky for days at a time. Avalanches moved without warning. One slide carried an entire work camp down the slope. How many died in that slide is unknown because the source material is thin and the company's records of it are incomplete. What the company did track was progress. Despite the granite, the winter, the avalanches, the isolation, the Chinese crews advanced the tunnels until the summit tunnel broke through and the line crested the Sierra Nevada and began its descent toward Nevada. Crocker reportedly said very little to acknowledge what that breakthrough had cost. The mountain had been the first true test. The men who answered it would not be remembered in the photograph. But the tunnels they blasted are still there, still dark, still exactly the width they drove through the mountain on their backs. The mountain was the first antagonist. It would not be the last. The Chinese workers were organized into gangs, crews of 12 to 20 men, each led by a headman who served as foreman, interpreter, negotiator, and sometimes banker for the group. The headmen dealt directly with the Central Pacific's white supervisors, taking assignments, translating instructions, managing the daily flow of work. Below them, the gang organized itself. Drillers, blasters, powder handlers, timber framers, graders, track layers, each function staffed by men who knew the work or who learned it from the man beside them. The work did not require constant supervision from above because it was supervised from within. The camps were separate. Chinese workers did not share quarters, cookhouses, or common spaces with white workers. The segregation was simply the assumption of the time, as natural to the company as the payroll gap, unremarked and unexamined. The Chinese camps had their own kitchens, staffed by cooks who traveled with the crew. Food came from supplies the workers purchased themselves: dried fish, rice, vegetables, pork when available, tea always. The tea was not a preference, but a practice. Boiling water killed pathogens that felled workers who drank from streams and barrels without that precaution. The Chinese crews lost fewer men to the waterborne diseases that periodically swept through the white camps, an advantage observed at the time and attributed to something vague and racial rather than to the simple technology of a boiling pot. The wages arrived monthly, in amounts that looked comparable to what white workers received until you accounted for what the company did not provide. White workers' food and lodging were included in their compensation. Chinese workers paid their own way. A worker earning $31 per month, and paying for his own provisions, was not earning $31 of disposable income. He was subtracting the costs of survival from that sum. The company knew this arithmetic. The company designed this arithmetic. Black powder charges were prepared by hand and ignited with fuses of inconsistent burn rates. Misfire handling, approaching a charge that had failed to detonate, was a regular and lethal problem. The company did not track injuries with any systematic care. It tracked miles of track laid and days of tunnel advanced. There were men who simply disappeared into the mountain. An avalanche, a tunnel collapse, a failed blast. These events produced bodies that were sometimes recovered and sometimes not. The Central Pacific did not maintain a central death record for its Chinese workforce. A record that is never started is not a record that is lost. When historians began piecing together mortality estimates a century later, they found fragments, oral accounts, missionary records, shipping manifests for bones returned to China for burial, but no central accounting because none had ever been made. The company kept its payroll structured to extract the maximum amount of labor for the minimum amount of money it could manage to pay. The system worked for the railroad. It worked for the bond payments and the schedule. It worked less well for the men inside it. But their satisfaction was not what the system had been designed to produce. Not slavery, not freedom, a precisely constructed dependency, indispensable to the project, compensated at a discount, and remembered in the aggregate rather than by name. Charles Crocker believed he understood his workforce. He had watched the Chinese cruise through the winter in the Sierra Nevada and into the spring thaw of 1867. He had seen them bore through granite that other men would not touch. He had seen them handle black powder with a care and precision that his white foremen struggled to match. He had reorganized his entire construction model around their capacity and collective discipline. And so, when someone asked him, in the spring of that year, whether he worried about labor trouble from the Chinese gangs, Crocker was direct. There was no danger of strikes among the Chinese, he said. They worked steadily. They gave no trouble. He was confident in a way that suggested the question had barely been worth asking. In June of 1867, thousands of Chinese workers put down their tools and stopped. The strike spread across roughly 30 miles of construction line in the High Sierra, encompassing gangs working at multiple sites simultaneously. The men did not scatter or wander. They stayed in their camps and presented a list of demands through their headmen, clearly and in writing. They wanted their monthly wages raised from $31 to $35 and then to $40, the same rate white workers earned. They wanted the workday shortened from 11 hours to 10 hours in open cuts and to 8 hours inside the tunnels, where the air from black powder smoke and inadequate ventilation made extended shifts physically dangerous. They put the logic plainly. 8 hours a day was good enough for white men, and it was good enough for them. And they wanted the right not to be subjected to physical punishment by white overseers, a demand that said something precise and difficult about what the daily texture of their working lives had actually contained. The demands were not radical by any standard a modern person would apply. They were the demands of men who understood exactly what they were worth to the project they were building. They had done the arithmetic that the company preferred they not do. They knew that the Central Pacific was being paid $48,000 per mile of track completed through mountain terrain. They knew what a month of delayed progress cost the company in forfeited bond money. They knew that no other workforce the company could assemble on the timelines it needed could replace them. They had leverage, and they were using it. The scale of the action was unprecedented. The 1867 Chinese railroad strike was, by some historical accounts, the largest organized labor action in the United States at that point in time. Thousands of workers, organized across miles of remote mountain construction, held a coordinated position without the support of any union structure, any legal protection, or any outside ally. They held it by the logic of collective refusal alone. Crocker's initial response was one of irritation rather than alarm. He described the suddenly quiet work camps as being just like Sunday all along the work. The tone of casual dismissal was a choice. Behind it, he was moving quickly. He reached out to labor contractors about the possibility of bringing in freed black workers from the South as replacements. Nothing came of it fast enough to matter. He considered importing workers from Mexico. That also went nowhere in time. The men who had stopped working controlled the Sierra Nevada crossing, and there was no realistic replacement for them. So Crocker chose a different weapon. He cut off the food supply. The Chinese workers' provisions came through the company's supply network. Crocker ordered the supply wagons to stop delivering to the striking camps. No food would reach the men until they went back to work. He was betting that men who were already living on carefully managed wages with little margin would not be able to sustain a prolonged withholding of food at altitude, far from any alternative supply. He was right. Within roughly a week, the strike collapsed. The men returned to work. They received a partial wage increase from $31 to $35 per month, but not the $40 they had demanded, and not the reduced hours in the tunnels, and not formal protection against physical punishment. Crocker declared it over and moved on. He returned to the problem of the summit, but what had happened in those weeks deserved more than the footnote it received in the company's memory. Thousands of men, in one of the most remote and physically demanding work environments in North America, had looked at the conditions of their employment and decided collectively that the conditions were wrong. They had not asked for equality. They had not challenged the racial structure of the camps or the fundamental logic of the pay gap. They had asked for a fairer portion of what their labor was producing. The company had responded with starvation rather than negotiation. The strikers went back to their tunnel faces. The company went back to its ledgers. The mountain waited. Years later, Crocker's account of what the Chinese workers had built through the Sierra would acknowledge, grudgingly and in general terms, how much the project had owed them. The strike would receive far less acknowledgement. The men who had stopped the construction of a transcontinental railroad for a week in the high mountains of California, with no union, no lawyers, and no supply chain of their own, were briefly described as having been difficult. Then they were described as having returned to work. Then, mostly, they were described no further at all. The railroad was finished. The strike was not part of the story the company chose to tell. But the hunger that ended it, that was real. And the men who went back to the tunnel faces carrying that knowledge were not the same men who had put down their tools. They had learned something about the company, and the company had learned something about them. Neither side forgot. By the spring of 1869, the race was almost over. The Central Pacific had come down out of the Sierra Nevada, crossed the Nevada desert, and was driving east through Utah. The Union Pacific was driving west from Wyoming to meet it. The two lines were converging north of the Great Salt Lake, and the question was no longer whether they would meet, but exactly where, because the land grants paid by the mile, and both companies had strong financial reasons to lay as many miles as possible before the junction was formally declared. On April 28, 1869, the Central Pacific crews accomplished something that had never been done on a railroad construction project before, and has rarely been matched since. They laid 10 miles of track in a single day. Charles Crocker had wagered $10,000 against a Union Pacific executive who claimed the feat was impossible. 800 Irish workers were brought in for the heavy rail lifting and spiking, but the broader crew, the graders, the tie layers, the spike handlers, the water carriers, was overwhelmingly Chinese. The work began before dawn and continued through the day, with a rhythm that observers described as almost mechanical. 1,700 tons of iron were moved and placed and spiked into position. 10 miles of functional railroad track where there had been open ground that morning. Crocker collected his BET. The record stood. 12 days later, on May 10, 1869, the golden spike was driven at Promontory summit. The ceremony had been planned for weeks. Special trains carried dignitaries from both coasts. The two locomotives, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's No. 119, were moved forward until they nearly touched. Champagne was produced. A polished laurel tie was laid across the gap. The ceremonial spike, cast from California gold, was lowered into its hole. The speeches were long. Photographs were taken. The telegrams went out. The Chinese workers who had built the western half of the transcontinental railroad were essentially absent from it. A small number may have been present at the edges of some images, barely visible, easily overlooked. The ceremony featured the executives of both companies, their guests, the political figures who had supported the project, and the symbolic instruments of completion. The men who had drilled and blasted and graded and spiked the thousands of miles of track stretching back to Sacramento were represented, in the ceremony's logic, by the track itself, by the thing they had made, rather than by their own presence in it. Leland Stanford did not drive the spike cleanly. He swung the maul and missed. The telegraph operator, prepared for the signal, sent the completion message anyway. The nation celebrated a clean blow that had not quite landed. Somewhere west of Promontory, stretching back through Utah and Nevada and over the Sierra Nevada into California, lay the work of 10,000 or more Chinese men, the tunnels they had blasted, the grades they had cut, the ledges they had carved from cliff faces while dangling on ropes. The company had said, when it needed to say it, that without them, the line could not have been completed. At the completion ceremony, the company found it was possible to proceed without them after all. The story of how the West was connected had already been arranged in a frame that left out most of the people who had connected it. It would take more than 100 years for the historical record to begin seriously correcting what that photograph had chosen not to show. In the meantime, the Big Four were already thinking about what came next. The golden spike was driven. The empire was just getting started. The men who ran the Central Pacific could have stopped. They had built what they promised. The transcontinental line was complete. The federal bonds had been earned. The land grants had been received. The nation had celebrated. By every measure of the original contract between the railroad and the government that funded it, the work was done. They could have collected their returns and lived the remainder of their lives in comfort and consequence. They had no interest in stopping. What the Big Four had discovered during the construction of the Central Pacific was something that could not be unfound. They had learned that a railroad was not simply a way to move people and goods from one place to another. A railroad was a machine for controlling geography. Whoever owned the line controlled the distance between any 2 points it connected, and whoever controlled distance could name the price of crossing it. That insight, simple, devastating, and perfectly legal, was the foundation of everything that came next. The Southern Pacific Railroad had existed on paper since the mid-1860s, a separate charter authorized to build south through California and eventually east toward a connection with Texas. By the late 1860s and into the early 1870s, the Big Four maneuvered their way into control of it and began using it to extend their reach in every direction the Central Pacific could not legally go. The logic of expansion was not sentimental, it was geometric. Every new mile of track the Southern Pacific built was a mile of geography brought under the company's pricing authority. Every town the line reached became a town that depended on the Southern Pacific to move its goods to market. Every route the company secured closed off the possibility of a competing line doing the same work at a lower price. The goal was not to connect the West. The goal was to own the connections, and through ownership, to own the terms on which commerce in the American West would be conducted. Congressional authorization extended the Southern Pacific's building rights south through California's Central Valley and toward Los Angeles, east along what would become the Sunset Route toward El Paso and New Orleans, and north toward Portland. The land grants accompanying these authorizations added millions of acres to the company's already enormous holdings. By the mid-1880s, the Southern Pacific controlled more than 7,000 miles of rail line and more than 3,000 miles of waterborne shipping routes, a reach that no single private company in the American West had ever possessed. In every freight office along that system, the company published a rate sheet, a printed document listing the price to move goods, grain, cattle, fruit, timber, manufactured goods, between any 2 points on the network. The rate sheet was not a negotiation, it was a declaration, and in most of California there was no competing sheet to set against it. Collis Huntington, who outlived the other three and became the public face of the Southern Pacific's later era, understood this better than anyone. He was not a builder in the way Judah had been a builder. He was a strategist, a man who thought in terms of routes and rates and political relationships and the long patience required to secure advantages that compounding time would make permanent. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was something more durable, a man who understood power systems and built them deliberately, one connection at a time. By the time the Southern Pacific's reach was fully assembled, the question of whether it had been built to serve California or to extract from it had become nearly impossible to separate. The infrastructure was real. The development, the population growth, the agricultural expansion, the railroad had enabled all of it. But the price of that enabling had been a dependency so complete that the terms of life in California, what it cost to ship a ton of grain, which harbor would anchor the state's foreign trade, which town would grow and which would wither, were set not by competition or democratic choice, but by a small group of men who had learned, above all other lessons, that control was more profitable than service. The spike was gold. The system it christened was something else entirely, and the communities that would live inside that system were only beginning to understand what dependence actually meant. Consider what it meant to be a farmer in California's Central Valley in the 1870s. You had come west with something, capital or labor, or simply determination, and you had turned raw land into something productive. You had cleared it and irrigated it and planted it and harvested it. You had built a barn and a house and maybe a small granary. Your wheat was good. Your soil was generous. You had done everything that the promise of California asked of you, and now you needed to sell what you had grown. The nearest railroad depot was the path to market, not one possible path among several, not the most convenient of various options, the only path. The Southern Pacific line that passed through the San Joaquin Valley or the Salinas Valley or the agricultural corridors around San Luis Obispo was the singular mechanism by which your grain or fruit or cattle could reach the processors, the wholesalers, the port, and ultimately the buyers who would pay you for it. Without the railroad, your harvest rotted or traveled by wagon at costs that erased any profit before the goods reached a buyer. Without the railroad, you were not a farmer with a market. You were a farmer with a field. Once the line existed and the farms organized themselves around it, once the granaries rose near the depots and the towns grew along the tracks, and the farms committed to crops whose volumes only made sense with rail transport, the railroad's pricing power was absolute. Freight rates were set by the company and published in schedules that the company could revise. A farmer shipping grain from the San Joaquin Valley to San Francisco did not negotiate his rate. He accepted the rate he was given, or he did not ship. If the rate changed between seasons, the farmer absorbed the change. If the rate in California was higher than the rate for equivalent distances in regions where competing railroads existed, the farmer absorbed that too. There was no competing railroad to appeal to. The rate sheets became the most consequential documents in the lives of these farming communities, more important in practical terms than the deed to their land, because the deed gave them ownership, and the rate sheet determined whether ownership was worth anything. A farmer who owned his land and his crop, but could not afford to move his crop to market at the rates the company set, was not a free man in any economically meaningful sense. He was a man with property and no power. The Southern Pacific's defenders, the company always had defenders because it also generated genuine prosperity in the regions it served, would point to the real development the railroad enabled. The Central Valley was not an agricultural empire before the railroad. The line opened the land to commercial farming at scale. Towns grew because the railroad reached them. Property values rose. Population followed. These things were true. The railroad did create conditions for prosperity that would not otherwise have existed. What the defenders rarely acknowledged was the structure beneath the prosperity. The company that brought the farmers their market also set the price of reaching it. The company that made the land valuable also owned millions of acres of that same land through its federal grants. The company that enabled California agriculture also determined, through its freight rate schedules, how much of the value that agriculture produced would remain with the people who grew the crops, and how much would be extracted by the company that moved them. This was not a system that required anyone to be evil. It required only that the people who ran it be rational, that they understand their pricing power and use it systematically. And the men who ran the Southern Pacific were nothing, if not rational. They had built a machine. The machine was working exactly as designed. The towns that the railroad decided not to serve or chose to bypass or connected only through branch lines with unfavorable rates understood the stakes in the sharpest possible way. A community that the Southern Pacific chose not to link to the main line was a community that the railroad had decided would not grow. The decision was rarely announced in those terms. It was expressed through routing choices and rate schedules and the quiet absence of a depot in a town that had hoped for one. But the effect was identical to a direct sentence. Places the railroad passed through became the future. Places the railroad passed by became the past. The farmers and merchants and town boosters who wrote letters to the company's agents and petitioned for better rates and organized meetings to discuss what the railroad was doing to their communities were not wrong about what was happening to them. They understood the mechanism clearly. They had reached the market, but only through the man who named the price. And the man who named the price had no competition to keep him honest, no regulator with real authority to restrain him, and no particular incentive to set a price that left more of the value of California's fields in the hands of the people who had planted them. This was what dependence looked like from inside it, not dramatic, Not a single crisis, just the slow, accumulating weight of a system that extracted a little more than was fair, year after year, from people who had no alternative to paying it. They had reached the market, but only through the man who named the price. Every great city needs a harbor, and every harbor, in the age of the railroad, needed to answer a question that had nothing to do with geography. Which company controlled the line that connected it to the interior? In Southern California in the 1870s and 1880s, that question was not abstract. It was the central fact of commerce, and it was contested with the energy of men who understood that the answer would determine which communities grew into cities and which remained permanent footnotes to someone else's ambition. The Southern Pacific, by the late 1870s, controlled the rail access to the Los Angeles basin. This was power of a specific and measurable kind. The company decided what it cost to move goods into and out of Southern California. It decided which routes were maintained and which were allowed to deteriorate. It decided, in practical effect, which communities along the coast were connected to California's economy and which were not. The harbor question crystallized the stakes in a way that even people who did not follow railroad politics could understand. Southern California needed a deep-water port. The contest was really between three locations. San Pedro had the natural advantages, deep water, solid position, and the support of most engineers who studied it. Long Beach had its own harbor ambitions and its own fraught relationship with the railroad. And then there was Santa Monica, where Collis Huntington had invested directly. Santa Monica was the Southern Pacific's preferred choice, and the reason was transparent to anyone who understood how the company thought. A harbor that the Southern Pacific had built, financed, and connected exclusively would be a harbor the Southern Pacific controlled completely. The rate sheet at that harbor would say whatever the company decided it should say, with no competing carrier to appeal to and no alternative route to threaten a change. The company lobbied Congress for Santa Monica. It presented engineering arguments and commerce projections. The men who carried those arguments to Washington traveled, as a matter of course, on free railroad passes, the company's customary instrument for ensuring that the people who made decisions affecting the Southern Pacific's interests had a standing reminder of whose network they depended on. San Pedro had its own advocates, and they pushed back hard enough that the federal government ultimately invested there rather than in Santa Monica. But the fight itself exposed the logic clearly. The company was not choosing a harbor for California. It was choosing a harbor for itself. The consequences of this logic were sometimes surreal in their specificity. Federal surveys of the region documented what Southern Pacific's freight pricing had produced in the San Pedro corridor. It cost more to move cargo from the harbor at San Pedro to the city of Los Angeles than it cost to ship that same cargo from Hong Kong to San Pedro in the first place. The distance from Hong Kong to San Pedro was roughly 6,000 miles across open ocean. The distance from San Pedro to Los Angeles was about 20 miles of California flatland. The transoceanic leg was cheaper, not slightly cheaper, dramatically cheaper. This was not a natural product of market forces. It was the arithmetic of monopoly, the price a captive shipper paid when there was no alternative route to negotiate against. The Long Beach situation illustrated a different dimension of the same power. In 1888, the city was attempting to secure a Santa Fe connection, a competing line offering the first real challenge to Southern Pacific's regional dominance. Charles Crocker moved to obstruct it. The maneuvering was legal, financial, and administrative, the kind of power that works through incorporation documents and right-of-way disputes, and the patient application of corporate leverage in venues where the public cannot easily watch. The effect was to delay and complicate the competing connection in ways that served the Southern Pacific's interests. By this point, a federal court case documenting the Southern Pacific's collateral holdings described mortgage security that included over 11 million acres of land. 11 million acres. The company that was fighting over 20 miles of California flatland between a harbor and a city had assembled a land empire larger than many American states, much of it granted by the same federal government that was now being lobbied over which harbor to dredge. The company fought harbors. It lobbied Congress about which ports received federal investment and which did not. It opposed competing lines at every stage of their development where opposition could be effective. It engaged in the patient, unglamorous work of maintaining geographic control, because geographic control was the foundation on which everything else rested. But in the years when the battles were still live, the people of Southern California's coastal communities understood what was actually at stake with a clarity that the railroad's public language tried to obscure. The company spoke the language of progress and development and connection. What it was actually managing was the terms on which Southern California would be allowed to connect to the world, and the price it would pay for that permission. They had reached the sea, but only through the man who controlled the shore. In the San Joaquin Valley, west of Tulare Lake, there is a stretch of land that settlers in the 1870s called Mussel Slough. Before they arrived, it was largely empty, flat, dry, full of potential that required water and labor and time to unlock. The settlers came because the Southern Pacific said they should. The company's land agents traveled the country promoting the Mussel Slough district as a place where a family could build a future. The land was fertile. The climate was favorable. The railroad would connect the harvest to the market. And the price of the land itself, railroad grant land, would be reasonable when the time came to buy. That last promise was the one that mattered most. It was the one the company had not made with the precision the settlers thought they had heard. The settlers moved on to the land and improved it. They dug irrigation canals at their own expense, built houses and barns, planted orchards and grain fields. They invested years of labor into land they did not yet technically own, expecting to purchase it at prices reflecting its value before their improvements had transformed it. The Southern Pacific had a different view. By the late 1870s, the company had concluded that the settlers' own improvements had increased the land's value, and that increased value belonged to the company, not to the people who had created it. The purchase price would reflect what the land was now worth after their labor, not what it had been worth before they arrived. The settlers organized. They formed the Settlers League and argued their case in newspapers, courts, the Federal Land Office, and Congress. They had been induced to improve land by the railroad's own agents, and now the railroad was using the value they had created as justification for prices they could not afford. The legal machinery tended to favor the company. The railroad held formal title. The settlers held improved land and the memory of what they had been told. In May of 1880, a federal marshal arrived to execute eviction orders. At a place called Brewer's Ranch, armed settlers confronted the marshal's party. Gunfire broke out. When it ended, 7 men were dead, 5 settlers and 2 of the men accompanying the marshal. The exact order of shots and who fired first remain contested in California historical writing to this day. The Southern Pacific's version was that the settlers were lawless resistors who had refused a federal court order. The settlers' version was that they were farmers defending land they had made valuable against a corporation that had taken their improvements and presented them with a bill for the privilege of staying. Both versions contained true facts. Neither contained the whole story. What the Mussel Slough massacre produced was something larger than either version intended. It became a symbol, most memorably in Frank Norris's novel The Octopus, published 2 decades later and built directly around these events. Mussel Slough stood for the fundamental question the Southern Pacific forced ordinary people to ask. When a corporation controlled land, water access, market access, freight rates, and the political machinery that was supposed to adjudicate disputes, what recourse did a farmer actually have? The company kept meticulous records of land values and pricing adjustments. It had learned this discipline in the 1860s, when its construction payrolls were managed with the same attention to what the company was owed. The names of the Chinese workers whose labor had created the system these settlers now depended on had been left out of many of those same ledgers. The company recorded what it needed to record. At Mussel Slough, it chose to record title and debt. What had been promised to the settlers remained in the same unmarked category as the missing names. The law had spoken. The dead still made their own argument. There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not march in the street or issue proclamations. It works through the ordinary machinery of governance, through committee assignments and regulatory appointments and the patient cultivation of relationships between men who share offices and favors, and the understanding that certain things are simply how things work. By the 1880s, the Southern Pacific had become a master of that kind of power, and California's political system had become, in significant measure, an extension of the company's operational needs. The instrument was not corruption in the simple sense of envelopes passed in dark rooms, though envelopes were certainly passed. The instrument was something more structural and more difficult to prosecute. Consider the railroad pass, a small card issued by the Southern Pacific that allowed a named individual to travel anywhere on the network at no cost. Judges received them, legislators received them, newspaper editors received them, candidates for office received them during campaigns. The pass was not a payment. It was a relationship, a standing reminder, renewed whenever the holder wanted to travel, of whose network connected California and who had chosen to make that connection available as a courtesy. The men who held passes were not formally obligated to anything. They were simply men who had been made comfortable, and who understood that comfort had a source. None of this required the Southern Pacific to be the only power in California politics. It required only that the company be present at every significant pressure point, that no major decision affecting the railroad's interests could be made anywhere in the state's political system without the company having a relationship, a history, or a lever available to it. The California Railroad Commission was the body nominally charged with regulating the Southern Pacific's rates and practices. In practice, the Commission became a demonstration of what happens to a regulatory body when the entity it regulates is more powerful than the government that created it. Commission appointments were subject to political influence the company exercised. Commission staff found that challenging Southern Pacific rates required resources and legal firepower the Commission rarely possessed. The body became so thoroughly aligned with the company's interests that observers began calling it the Southern Pacific Literary Bureau. A public relations office for the railroad maintained at state expense, designed to perform the appearance of oversight while producing none of its substance. Collis Huntington managed the Washington dimension personally. He maintained a permanent lobbying presence in the capital across multiple decades, working against railroad regulation bills with a patience and tactical sophistication that earned him a reputation as perhaps the most effective corporate lobbyist of his era. He was not subtle about what he was doing. He was simply very good at it, and the system he was working inside was not designed to stop him. The people of California could see who traveled on free railroad passes and draw conclusions about what those passes purchased, They could watch the Railroad Commission issue rulings and compare those rulings to the company's stated preferences. They understood the system they were living in. They had simply not yet assembled the political force to change it. The railroad did not own California. It had simply learned how to make California's institutions serve its needs. The difference was meaningful in law and nearly invisible in practice. In 1885, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad completed its line into Los Angeles from the east. It sounds like a simple logistical fact, but the arrival of the Santa Fe was something the region's residents recognized immediately as different in kind from anything that had happened since the Southern Pacific's grip had been fully assembled. For the first time in a generation, there was a second railroad. For the first time, a shipper in Los Angeles had a choice. Both companies began cutting rates. What followed became known as the Great Rate War. Passenger fares between the Mississippi Valley and Los Angeles fell to levels that seemed impossible. At the peak of the competition, the fare from Kansas City to Los Angeles dropped to $1. A single dollar for a transcontinental journey that had cost vastly more under the monopoly regime. The number illustrates with perfect clarity what monopoly pricing had been doing to the region for the years before competition arrived. People came. They came in numbers that transformed Southern California from a sparsely settled agricultural district into something that was beginning to look like a mass destination. Land speculation caught fire. The population of Los Angeles grew at a rate that astonished even the optimists, who had long believed the city was destined for significance. The rate war eventually settled into a new equilibrium, lower than the monopoly era, but not as extreme as the competitive peak. But it had made something visible that the company had spent years obscuring. If fares fell immediately and dramatically the moment a second railroad appeared, then the rates that had prevailed under the monopoly had not been the natural price of moving people and goods. They had been the monopoly price, the price that became possible when there was no one to compete against. The farmers, the merchants, the agricultural shippers who had spent years paying whatever the Southern Pacific asked, they had not been paying the cost of transportation. They had been paying a tax levied by a company that controlled the only road. The rate war proved it empirically, in real time, in a form any person in Southern California could see and measure. Competition did not create the Los Angeles boom. It revealed what monopoly had been suppressing. The boom was the shape of demand that had always existed underneath the prices that had kept it from being expressed. The Santa Fe's arrival did not end the Southern Pacific's power in California. The company remained dominant through most of the state, and the political relationships Huntington had built did not dissolve because one competing line had reached one city in the South. But something had shifted. The mythology of the Southern Pacific as an inevitable and necessary power had been cracked, not broken, cracked. The crack ran through everything that followed. The people who would eventually force a reckoning were not working in a vacuum. They were working in a state that had watched the rate war and understood, from lived experience, what competition could do to prices that had seemed permanent. They were working with an electorate that had accumulated across 40 years a specific and detailed grievance. The crack let that grievance see daylight. Competition did not create the opening. It exposed what had always been waiting on the other side of the prices that monopoly had built to keep it out. By 1911, California had seen enough. The progressive movement that swept into the state's government that year was not a sudden eruption. It was 40 years of accumulated anger focused into a political program with specific targets. Hiram Johnson won the governorship on a platform whose central promise was almost comically direct. He would kick the Southern Pacific out of California politics. Not out of California, the railroad was too large and too embedded to expel, but out of the regulatory appointments, the legislative backrooms, the formal and informal relationships that had made the company's interests and the state's interests interchangeable for a generation. The reforms that followed were real. The Railroad Commission was restructured with expanded authority. The direct primary weakened the party organizations the Southern Pacific had used to manage candidate selection. The initiative, the referendum, and the recall gave California voters tools that did not root through a legislature the railroad had learned to manage. But it would be a mistake to read this as the moment California was set free. The infrastructure did not change with the political reforms. The 7,000 miles of rail line still belonged to the company. The port relationships, the land holdings, the competitive advantages baked into decades of monopoly, none of that was dismantled by a reformed regulatory process. The machine was still there, simply more carefully watched. The deeper question, what do you do with a railroad after you have built it, remained unanswered. The infrastructure is essential. You cannot disassemble it without destroying the economy built around it. And the line between a company's interests and the public good is not always visible until after the damage is done. The Chinese laborers who built the Sierra Nevada crossing were recognized by Congress only in 2012, 143 years after the Golden Spike. The death toll is still not fully known. The names are still largely absent from the payroll records. The tunnels they blasted are still there. The Mussel Slough farmers are part of a pattern of infrastructure-enabled extraction that did not end with the Southern Pacific. The particular machinery changes, the logic does not. The harbor decisions made in the 1880s and 90s, which port received federal investment, which community was chosen, which was bypassed, shaped the physical geography of Southern California in ways that are still visible in where the freeways run and where the industry settled and which cities grew into what they are. The regulatory capture that turned the California Railroad Commission into a performance of oversight became a template that industries with political resources have studied and reproduced ever since. None of this is an argument that the railroad should not have been built. It should have been. The connection it created was real. The prosperity it enabled was real. But prosperity and justice do not automatically travel together. When a small group of men gains control of the mechanism that everyone else must use to participate in economic life, they gain something that looks like service but functions like rule. They can call it connection. They can call it progress. They can celebrate it with gold and ceremony and the grateful applause of a nation that needed what they built. And they will not be entirely wrong. That is what makes the story so difficult to leave behind. The railroad did connect the West. In doing so, it also taught a handful of men how to turn distance into power, labor into profit, and dependence into rule. Those lessons outlasted the company that first taught them. The Golden Spike is in a museum now. The system it christened left deeper marks than any single piece of gold ever could. And the question it leaves open, whether the empire was the price of modernity or a hijacking of it, is not a historical question. It is a live one. It will keep being answered differently, depending on who is asked and what they have been made to pay.